We're up to we're up to our dessert, the last panel, which should be
We have to be sweet, I guess.
a good way to wound up this session. And we'll get a new title in a minute, but it's basically about development and the challenges to development. And we have a group here who are extremely well qualified to talk about that on a global level. And of course, it gives me the greatest pleasure to have this panel moderated by the co-chair of the Bretton Woods Committee and someone who is known to all of us here as the former president of the World Bank Group for 10 years during the most, in my view, most productive period of its existence, Jim Wolfensohn. We're so happy to have him as co-chair, and we're very happy to have him with us. And I know that half of this group has come up to say hello to him again. And he will be, and I won't even attempt to go into what he's done besides the World Group, the World Bank Group experience, but you'll see it all in the CVs. We have a very distinguished panel beginning, and all of those are worth looking at in terms of their CVs, including in particular Mohammed Al-Jasser, who had served when he was a younger fellow beginning at both the bank and the IMF here in Washington, and ending up with a very, very continuing distinguished career. And with that, Jim, if I may turn to you for your
Well, thank you very much, Dick, and we want to welcome our three speakers and thank them very much for agreeing to participate. I must say that to start with, I'm thrilled to have Mohammed Al-Jasser here, who is a longtime friend from Saudi Arabia and who seems to get every month a new appointment that is higher than the last one. And it is really quite remarkable. And
Trying to find something good I could do.
Oh, you can do anything. But if you look at the resume, you'll find that it is quite extraordinary. And even recently, an additional set of responsibilities which he has for a country which, as I need hardly tell you, is facing many different issues at this time. And to have the leadership in the hands of people like Mohammed is really very comforting, I think, for the world. Enrique Garcia Rodriguez, I am happy to say I've known for a very long time. I've always regarded him as just taking care of Latin America for all the rest of us. And we're very happy to have you here, Enrique. And a new friend that I've found who, I'm happy to say, worked for a period of time at the World Bank, so he must be extremely well trained, Joachim von Amsburg, and who is now, for the last 6 or 8 months, is it, Joachim, who's now working with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and who is going to tell us, I hope, about what they're doing and the additions that they're making. So we have a really interesting group to explore the world with. But I thought that in view of the earlier discussions, it might be a good idea to start immediately from the point of view of the Middle East, which has scarcely been mentioned today, which I find quite surprising. But may I ask you to get us started?
Thank you, Jim. And I feel privileged to be back within the group of development economists and those who have been in the international public policy making. I appreciate Dick and the Bretton Woods Group invitation to be here. Well, the Middle East is part and parcel of the global economy, and it benefits from the advantages and it suffers from the disadvantages of the global economy. Of course, if you take the Middle East, or particularly the Arab countries, there has been a precipitous decline in oil prices and oil revenues, on which they depended to a significant level, and therefore we had to re-engineer our macroeconomic policies. In the olden days, you remember, Jim, when oil prices went down in the 80s or in the 90s, we had a very nice process of what I called counter-cyclicality. So in the good days, we did not spend all the revenues that were coming in. We paid off our debts and saved for the rainy day. Well, and on the downturn, we were able, therefore, not to put our foot on the brakes as hard as others had to. We spent more than we were taking in. We're doing it this time also, but this time is different, actually. If you look at the oil markets, there are more supplies, more secular supplies than there used to be, and there is a weakening of global demand for oil prices. And I think this is something maybe we can talk about later, but it's a significant differentiation between this time and the previous times. Therefore, Saudi Arabia particularly decided that since this time it's different, then we really have to re-engineer our economic policies. And therefore, the transformation program that has been announced and the vision of 2030 was also announced by the government, which is basically to go through major transformation of the economy to wean it a lot more than before from its dependence on oil, to regain the efficiency of the economy that may have weakened over the years because of the affluence of oil, and also to take into account the changes in our demographics. Now the Saudi population is much larger. They're a lot more educated than before, but they need more skills also. Jim, you remember, and we talked about this before, if you went to Saudi Arabia in the 60s and the 70s, even to the mid-80s, our concern in the education system was with eradicating illiteracy.
That's right.
So we were just, can you read and write? Well, now that is totally insufficient. We need the right set of skills within our young people, and therefore we're shifting the emphasis in our educational system to skills, 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 as one of my the previous participants said, and that goes to the universities and to the vocational educational institutions. And hopefully that will allow us also to substitute more of the Saudi labor to the expatriate labor who have been with us and continue to contribute significantly, and we're very grateful for that, to our economic development. So now, in the olden days when you were at the World Bank and before, it was economics of development that was paramount in everybody's mind. I think now we need a new field. We need a field of economics of efficiency. There's so much efficiency that is lost in all of our economies, not just developing economies, but industrial economies. We were talking about labor markets in some countries like Italy and France and other places where a lot of growth potential can be harnessed if those inefficiencies were eliminated. In our economy, there is a lot of that, and we're doing it. For example, finally, some of our regulatory agencies were within the ministries that were supposed to regulate. So part of the restructuring, and this is what I'm stuck with now, is that they said that shouldn't be. You need a policymaker, you need a provider of the service, and you need the regulator. And the three have to be autonomous, and the interaction is supposed to deliver a more efficient or a more optimal outcome. So the Electricity and Cogeneration Regulatory Agency has been separated from the Ministry of Electricity. I was asked to chair that board. And then the Competition Council, that was part of the Ministry of Commerce, which is equivalent to the FTC here, it has been separated, and I was asked also to chair the board. So there are structural changes are happening every day as we speak, including, of course, retrenchment in the current spending, which has been a significant part of the budget, and therefore fiscal consolidation is happening. It's creating some murmurings within the economy, but I think people do understand that this is a necessary precondition to stabilize the macro picture and allow the structural adjustment measures to take place. Of course, I didn't mention the geopolitical pressures that complicate everything in our region, and I will leave that to your imagination. It's not making it easy for us to do all the good things that we need to do and to focus on.
And maybe to our questions also. I think it might be a good idea if we went through our three colleagues and get a statement. So can we ask you to give me a comment on the way you see your region?
Okay, well, I think Latin America is in a point of inflection, I would say. Let's go back a little bit. We learned the hard way in the first with import substitution in the 50s. Then we had a very good decade in the 60s. On the 70s, we were doing fine, but then we got a little crazy. The petrodollars came to us, and many of us here, we are in governments, we started to get, easy money. And then came the debt crisis. And together with it, in the early 80s, we had the issues of hyperinflation in many countries, mismanagement, and we had to adjust, and to adjust very seriously. So for Latin America, the 80s was a lost decade. And there was a good lesson, because we learned the hard way that one lesson was you don't play with macroeconomic stability. And one of the good things that you can see today in Latin America is that with very few exceptions, the macroeconomic teams are very good. We have some exceptions, I agree, but that was the good one. Well, what happened then? We started with the reforms, and Jim was at the World Bank. We were together in many things, and certainly Latin America had, starting in this millennium, a very, very positive cycle. Until about 2008, it was excellent. We had a very reasonable growth, about close to 4.5%. But then came the crisis in 2008, but Latin America reacted in a very positive way. And we restored growth, and we continue. But, of course, in the last 2 years, things have changed. And that's why I say we are in a point of inflation. What were the good things that we got? First, that reasonable growth was accompanied with macro stability in general in most countries. And the other thing, a very crucial element in Latin America, substantial reduction of poverty. And the inclusion of millions of Latin Americans in the middle class. That was a very successful story. That's a very good thing. But now things have changed. Yeah. What's the question? Where is Latin America today? It's in a crisis? No, it's not. Of course, if you look at the figures, if you talk about Latin America is not one Latin America. One thing is Mexico, another thing is the Caribbean, another thing is Central America, even South America is one thing, the Andean region one thing, the other. But in general, what we can say is that Latin America has been too tied up to a traditional comparative advantage model, too linked to commodities, which imply that in good years, we have been very happy. And in fact, during these last 15 years, in addition to good macro policies, we were lucky enough, especially in South America, the Chinese effect, the prices of commodities. Oh my God, it was extraordinary. I recall, I was in my country in the 80s, I was head of the Economic and Social Cabinet in Bolivia. And just to tell you, the first day I was appointed minister, I looked at the international net reserves, and they were negative $150 million. You know, what are the net reserves of President Morales in Bolivia today? About $14 billion, which is almost 50% of GDP. Well, The Chinese effect was there. So we got that. But there was a lot of complacency in the region, in my opinion, and we didn't take enough advantage of those conditions to jump to what's necessary looking at the future, to go from the traditional model of comparative advantage to a model of dynamic comparative advantage and competitive advantage, which has to do a lot with innovation, with technology. We're having to move from pure commodities to have value added, but in a competitive way, to insert the region in the chains of production and trade. Well, that's the thing. Now, we have the problem of low growth. If you look at the figures, Latin America is showing for this year, and last year was marginally negative growth. But one has to be careful. The weight of two economies there makes the difference. And that's Brazil, which, as you know, has had a recession for a couple of years and still continue to be with low growth, and Venezuela. But if you exclude these two countries, you know, all of the other ones have gone down, but still they are in a level which is reasonable. But the serious question that we have, and as head of a multilateral development bank for Latin America, is should we be satisfied with the projections that the IMF, the World Bank, and us have about growth in the next few years? 2-3%, and the answer is no. We made a study on the projection of Latin America 2050 and making a comparison to a very successful emerging region, which is Asia. And the conclusion was as follows. Latin America, if it wants to converge in income per capita with industrialized countries in the next 25, 30 years, or to be close to it, and at the same time to be able to keep the success story in middle-class development and improvement quality of life, cannot be satisfied with rates of growth below 5%. Well, so if we're talking about the next few years growing at 2-3%, we're in trouble. Because actually what is happening, let's take Brazil, for instance. All the people, they went out of poverty and believe they are in the middle class. If you continue having negative growth or low rates of growth of 2-3% or less than that, what happens is many of them will return to poverty. And this has very serious social and political consequences. So what is the advice? The advice is let's try to rebuild a long-term agenda at the country level and regional level. Because the changes that you require to move from a traditional comparative advantage model to that of competitive advantage requires many of the things that have been discussed. You need infrastructure. Of course, Latin America is only investing about 3% of GDP compared to Asia about 8%. We have to invest double. Education, and like you said, Angel Gurria insisted in the previous panel, it's not the traditional one. We are too many economists, lawyers, and socialists. We need skills. We need people who are going to be capable of insert themselves. Precisely in our annual report on the economy this year, the emphasis is precisely on that skills. Okay, institutions. How do you ensure that institutions, not only at the public sector level, but in the corporate level, are transparent and continue to be? All these elements require not 4 years or 5 years, require 15, 20 years. And when you make the comparison with Asia, of course, with due a lot of respect to what Korea has done, Singapore has done, and China is doing, so forth. But one thing is to have the type of democratic system that we have, that you have 4 or 5 years, and you change. How do you build in democracy a basic consensus on these issues? These are some of the elements that we are working in, and I think that Latin America has a very good opportunity to move ahead and to restore a path of growth that will be of better quality because it will be stable, efficient, inclusive, and one issue which is crucial, sustainable from the standpoint of the environment. So these are some of the elements. It's not easy. at the end, I would say it's not so much an economic or financial issue. At the end, it's a political issue. If you look at the region, you look what is happening in several of the countries, in Brazil, some of the fragility in the new governments because they don't have majorities. So what the lesson is, how do you get compromises? How do you get consensus on basic issues so that you can have, within the context of democracy, a clear-cut, long-term agenda?
Thank you very much. We've moved now from the Middle East to Latin America, and now we're moving to Asia, and to a very interesting situation with Joachim von Amsburg, who, as I think you know, was very active in the World Bank. Certainly I knew that. Spent time in Indonesia and the Philippines, and within the last year has moved to an institution that was challenging in terms of its potential. Years ago, it is of course, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I wonder if you could give us some comments on Asia, viewed from both points of view. You've been at the Chinese-sponsored bank for less than a year, if I understand it, and it'd be very interesting for us to hear, I think, how the structure is changing.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for having me representing the new kid on the block of multilateral development institutions, the AIIB. Asia, of course, is half the planet, so I will not spend much time trying to give a broad vision of Asia, which, of course, is a region that, by and large, has done extraordinarily well in terms of economic development over the last decades. Has done well based on sound macro policies and, in particular, openness, driven by trade in waves, starting in Japan, then going to the tigers, then, of course, going to China, going to Vietnam, maybe going to India even further, and having driven economic development very strongly by an external orientation of these economies. But then these very high-level stories hide so much differentiation, so much differences between economies, cultures, and cultures that are so distinct. It hides the countries that have not done so well in the Asian context. Some countries that are struggling with the institutional setting that will enable development, that struggle with some of the problems that you've just reported from Latin American countries. So I think we have to be very careful not to generalize. Of course, two big questions dominate the future of Asia, and these are the questions related to the two giants in Asia. One is, what is the next phase of development in China going to look like? And secondly, will India pick up the pace, and will India be the country that, as the second giant in Asia, can actually drive economic development of the region in a similar way as China has done in the last couple of decades? Now, so in some ways, Asia is different. Asia is, by and large, a success story. And yet, I think the development of Asia, if you take a long-term perspective, actually faces the same challenges as development than anywhere in any other part of the world. And ultimately, long-term development is all about three basic questions. One, can economies grow? Can economies generate wealth on a sustained basis? Secondly, can that wealth accrue to the broad set of the population of the country? Can the growth be equal? Can the growth be broad-based so that the population benefits from the growth? And thirdly, can the growth be environmentally sustainable? Can it be made compatible with the physical limits of the planet we're living on? I'm mentioning those three fundamental challenges to development because ultimately, I think reflection on those challenges led to the creation of the institution I've recently joined, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because the initiators, and in particular China as the leading country that initiated the bank, I think carry a very deep conviction that investment in infrastructure is indeed a key mechanism for pursuing these three fundamental development challenges. Infrastructure first as a driver of economic development, And China is probably a unique experience in terms of a country that has driven economic development through forward-looking infrastructure development. Very, very different from how infrastructure has developed in other parts of the world, including other parts of Asia, where infrastructure is lagging behind economic development, where infrastructure is catching up with congestion, catching up with excess demand for power, for water, for transport services. Very different in China, where infrastructure has been used quite proactively as a driver of economic development, proactively planning development in different places. Secondly, infrastructure investments have been a driver of employment and therefore of broad-based development. In the construction phase, through actual construction labor. Secondly, through the economic activity that is being facilitated by infrastructure investments, and that creates jobs. And then thirdly, and extremely importantly, infrastructure investments will determine in some ways the future of the planet in ecological terms. If you believe those studies that have done these compilations of the trillions of dollars needed of infrastructure investments, the big McKinsey study that shows $90 trillion of infrastructure investments are needed globally in the next 15 years. It matters tremendously whether these $90 trillion will be invested in, for example, low-carbon energy supplies or in a business-as-usual scenario. It will matter whether they will be invested in sustainable cities that minimize energy consumption or will be invested in normal business-as-usual infrastructure. So there are tremendously important choices about what infrastructure to invest in, whether this will become stranded assets that may not be usable in a carbon-constrained world, or whether these infrastructure investments will be the driver of an ecologically sustainable future, will be decisive considerations. So I think these three motivations, growth, equality, and environmental sustainability, have motivated the creation of a bank exclusively dedicated to investing in infrastructure in Asia. So we hope that we can make our modest contribution toward pursuing these three objectives.
Thank you very much. And I think we've had three very interesting presentations on three different parts of the world. I'm coming back now to you, Mohammed, if I may.
Sure.
You don't need to answer this question if you don't want to, but it's impossible to talk about. It's impossible to talk about the economic future of your region without thinking about what's been happening politically recently. And I'm wondering if there is anything that you can do to give us some sense of your own feeling about how important the recent political developments are in the region, or whether we should just at the moment continue with our economic analysis and put aside the question of politics until we see how it emerges.
Somebody mentioned that maybe economics should revert back to, I think, you can hear me, right? Yeah, that we should revert back to our old name, political economy. Political stability is a necessary condition for any economic development process, and this is not a discovery. Our region now suffers from very serious political tensions, and I think globally we need to all cooperate to bring about stabilization of the political conditions in the region. Saudi Arabia has been trying its best in spite of what sometimes is heard in some quarters, has been trying to bring about peace in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. Efforts, for example, Yemen, there were meetings in Kuwait, there were meetings in Oman, there were meetings in Geneva. We've been trying every channel to bring about that political stability into the region. Unfortunately, there are forces that seem to believe that more chaos is good for them. It's unfortunate, but we hope that the international community will bring to bear, because this is not just this region. What affects this region will affect the rest of the world, and world peace is really something paramount these days, because some mischievous behaviors can really get even much more serious if the world is not clear on its unacceptance of these types of behaviors. But we have no illusion in Saudi Arabia that political stability in our region is good for us. It is something that we desire. And I think, just as we were talking about infrastructure, I mean, already we are drawing up plans for infrastructure development in Yemen, which needs it much more. So the money that is being spent on other activities should be poured into the country to develop it. It's our neighbor. It's pretty much the same people. But I think those who are from outside that region should stay outside the Arabian Peninsula and let Yemen develop. And I think there is great commitment from the GCC as a whole to develop Yemen infrastructurally, educationally, and the healthcare. And they need it badly. But you can't do these things without any political stability in the region. So I think I call upon all who can contribute to that to really help bring about peace into the region, because we've had more than our share of suffering, be it in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, or other parts. Lebanon, for example. Yeah.
If one looks at Latin America, are there issues confronting you of a political nature?
Well, definitely, as I said before, I think that we're at a point where the traditional environment for politics has changed. And it has to do a lot with technology. It's a very important thing. In the past, the intermediary was the traditional political party. You had a congressman and so forth. Today, there are the social networks and so forth, that the ones that intervene. That's one point. Second thing, that people in general are very unsatisfied with the institutional setting and some of the issues that affect not only Latin America, but in general the world, is the issues of transparency, the issues of corruption, and so forth. And that's the bad news. The good news is that we can see that things are happening. For instance, we have seen the case of Brazil. You know, we are concerned about Brazil because, you know, growth has been lower, and we had the situation of impeachment of the former president. But at the end of the day, one thing that is very important and impressive is that you have shown that in Brazil you have a separate judicial system. That's a very important thing. So I would say that the next few years will be very important to rebuild the institutional setting, to have more separation of powers, which is what you have in the United States and other parts. In Latin America, some countries do that, but others have too much concentration of power. You have, you know, the executive branch has everything. And of course, people are getting tired of that. But going back to the issue of growth, I think that to try to tie up the political environment with the issues on the economic side in Latin America, two things or three things that I didn't mention before. One is the investment ratios are low, relatively, in the 20s, 20%. That's an average. Savings ratio are about 18%. So if you really want to grow at 4, 5, 6% on a regular basis, you have to either increase savings, but you can't do to go to extremes. You have to attract foreign investment, and that's a very crucial element. And precisely one thing that I'm very pleased to see that you have the infrastructure bank, the new one, because let me tell you one thing. Thanks to what probably was a little before you were in the World Bank, decided to have the mission of the banks, the World Bank, the IDB, on the social issues and infrastructure, which was the central thing in the World Bank in the past, became important but lower. And in our case, there was a window of opportunity. And in fact, the transformation of my institution from a small and young institution to one that has 20 countries, and in infrastructure we are leaders in the region, was thanks to infrastructure. So the great challenge is how to tie up you know, the private sector, foreign investment, with new instruments, attract funds that are in the sovereign funds and other places. And the issue which is very crucial, which I would like to mention, is you have to have the right type of studies. Environment is something that you mentioned, and I want to emphasize. Traditionally, what we have seen is that all the engineers prepare the beautiful projects in infrastructure, the road, energy, so forth. Then comes the economic, the financial side. When you're ready, you want to go to the World Bank or to the Asian Development Bank or the Inter-American Bank or the CAF and say, oh my God, we forgot the environment. Then you call the consultants to make a study to mitigate the risks. That's wrong. What we are not doing, and I think you will be doing the same, is to have a philosophy that in the pre-feasibility stage, you should include the environmental issues, because that is precisely what defines the right alternative in technical terms that is compatible with the issues of the environment. So in essence, I think political in Latin America is not a very serious matter, but it's something to worry. But of course, there is a transition. And of course, I think in Asia, you have been able to do many things because the political systems have been different. You can plan 50 years. I admire Korea. For instance, Korea in 1965 had an income per capita of $400, and today what it has. But they had a long-term plan, they made infrastructure, they made education, they made institution. But it's not the same as the system, political system that we have in Latin America. So that readjustment is very important.
I have one last question to Joachim, based on my experience since I'm getting so old. Until 1995, we had what I called an 80-20 world. We had a world in which 1 billion people from the wealthy countries had 80% of global GDP, and 5 billion people had 20%. Now we're projecting that by 2050, the billion people will grow to 1.25 billion, and the 5 billion will grow to 8 billion. Mm-hmm. And instead of it being an 80-20 world, it'll be a 40-60 world. And that is a very different world that plays in to what you're going to be doing in your new job. To what extent are you looking at the politics and the leverage and the responsibilities that you have with that new distribution of wealth?
I think in some ways the creation of the institution I'm working for, the AIIB, reflects some of the changes in global weight and global politics. I think it's no secret to say that the AIIB was born out of two concerns of emerging countries, and in particular China as the leading initiator with the existing arrangements. One concern was the desire to stretch and expand the existing multilaterals to invest more in infrastructure. And I think frustration with the lack of the ability of the existing institutions to do that, to grow adequately with the demand that is there for infrastructure investment. The second concern was, I think, the lack of flexibility of the existing system of giving more voice to emerging economies like China. And I think the frustration with the delay in the 2010 quota reform of the IMF was then sort of the last straw on the camel's back that triggered China to take the initiative forward to initiate this new bank. Then I think China was confronted and invited other countries to join that effort. I think the decision by not only many other Asian nations, but in particular European countries to join that endeavor has given it a particular dynamic. A dynamic where Europeans in particular were very, very committed to ensuring that this new bank they would join was committed to the highest social and environmental standards, was committed to high quality projects that adhere to all the experiences that the World Bank and others have gathered with what constitutes projects that actually achieve their benefits rather than hurt through environmental or social side effects people. I think there was a very strong commitment to very effective governance, very transparent governance, very much borrowing from the existing institutions. A multilateral governance structure where, in this case, the 57 member countries of AIIB oversee and guide the activities of the bank. I think the initiators, China, saw the coming together of European countries and Asian countries in particular as an opportunity for really showcasing that an emerging country can be a leader of a multilateral institution. And I think that dynamic actually has been very favorable, allows us now to move forward with building an institution. Starting from scratch, building on the experience of the existing institutions, the World Bank and other banks, taking what is working well. The, I think, very effective overall governance structure of multilateral banking, where you have to form compromises, where you have to find clear directions under the political leadership of a board, but with the very technical orientation of a staff. So you have, in this way, created a bank, or we are creating a bank, that follows the best practice of existing institutions, but tries then to innovate, tries to be efficient. Mm-hmm. We have given ourselves the mantra clean, green, and lean. Mm-hmm. Clean meaning free of corruption, green means environmentally sustainable, and lean means efficient. We have literally 80 staff right now, 80. Oh. So we're at the very beginning, but we're very, very lean. And yes, we will grow, but we will not grow into the thousands. We will grow to a still very modest institution that will try to stay very agile, very quick, and literally very lean.
Maybe a little comment on governance. Yeah, I think interesting. My institution has a different model of governance, which I just would like to highlight. First thing, we don't have the concept of donor countries and recipient countries. With the exception of Spain and Portugal, which are outside Latin America, the rest are Latin America. But nonetheless, Spain and Portugal are eligible for loans support. And in fact, we have that. Second thing, very important, Jim, we don't have a resident board. Very important. No bureaucrats in the middle. The members of the board are the ministers, the equivalent of the governors here, so they meet 3 times a year. But decisions are, as you mentioned, very important in the hands of technical staff and following. Third thing, voting power. There is no proportional vote. It's parity vote. 1 director, 1 vote. So this is, in essence, has been a very important factor. And I think we look forward, an institution like yours, and the BRICS Bank, so forth, because I think we have a common denominator in some of the things. I just wanted to quote that.
I took the wrong job.
Yes, you shall. You know, I'm sure that you have, you would have enjoyed much more my job than yours.
Are there questions?
Related to Asia, Thomas Mroczkowski, American University. What fascinates us these days is the vision of the Silk Road. To what extent was your institution created to fulfill that dream? To what degree? And maybe you could fill us in a little bit on what you see as progress with this fascinating infrastructural vision. Thank you.
No, thanks for that question. I think China has put forward this vision of rebuilding the Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road concept of creating, rebuilding the connectivity between Asia, Europe, Asia, and Africa. I think has put forward this challenge to coordinate infrastructure investments across these countries in order to facilitate trade and connectivity between, in particular, these three continents. The AIIB has not been set up specifically to finance the Silk Road or One Belt, One Road. AIIB has a broader mandate. We work with and for all our member countries, including some which are not directly related to the Silk Road, So at the same time, we will invest in projects that lie along the Silk Road and the One Belt, One Road corridor, because there's a very strong overlap. And the One Belt, One Road concept is meant to tie together East Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Europe, of course. And many of our member countries lie across those corridors. We see as a multilateral development bank that we have a particular advantage in helping coordinate investments across countries. Infrastructure investments that are multinational, cross-country, naturally have spillover effects, nationally have coordination challenges. And just like the other multilateral development banks, we have a relative advantage being at the same time investor and having the countries as our shareholders allows us in a particular way to help coordinate these investments between the East Asian, Central Asian, and Eastern European countries, to take the example of some of these transport corridors. So we, as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, have given ourselves 3 priority themes. The first is connectivity. This is really helping with transport and energy, very importantly, energy connectivity between countries in Asia. Secondly, green infrastructure investments, I mentioned that earlier, the focus on low carbon growth. And thirdly, mobilization of private capital. Because when you look at the investment needs for the Silk Road, for One Belt, One Road, for other infrastructure priorities, even with the new banks, we are still so small. We are talking about, in our case, adding maybe the capacity of some additional $15 billion a year of investment. That compares to these investment needs in the trillions of dollars. So unless we are able to unlock private capital to flow into these investment projects, we are just a drop in the bucket. So we want to, together with others, this is a monumental task and many agencies are involved, help create more of the conditions that are necessary for allowing, in particular, institutional capital to invest in emerging country and developing country infrastructure, to realize this from billion to trillion vision that was articulated last year by the development banks in the context of the Financing for Development agenda.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. It's really amazing to be discussing a new development bank in front of the grandfather of the development banks.
Thank you.
The Bretton Woods institutions. And I think the question is really, what are the lessons that you are benefiting from? That is, things they have done successfully that you want to do, and what are things they have not done which you would like to do? Let me propose one of the latter, and I'd like your reaction to that. The World Bank and others were set up to do both loans and guarantees, but they are mostly lenders, not guarantors. And if you want to catalyze private sector investment, as Mr. Wolfensohn knows very well, and you have mentioned the same, there is tons of money in the private sector. What they do not have is risk-bearing capacity. So a guarantee structure like MIGA is far more powerful in concept than a lender, because the money is out there in spades. So is that a lesson you're taking from the grandfather, or is that not a lesson?
Thank you. I learned development banking under Jim Wolfensohn, so many of the lessons, I think, come from his leadership of the World Bank. And the starting point is using a very, very successful model of multilateral development banking, and then trying to improve on it. But the very successful model has many ingredients. Let me just mention 2. One is the governance structure. I think the multilateral political board and a very technical management, I think, are a fascinating structure that allows the MDBs to combine the technical and the political in a rather unique and very effective way. Secondly, the basic financial structure of leveraging scarce public resources that are put as capital into these banks has been an incredible success story. The leverage that taxpayers get from putting capital into these institutions is something we need to explain and share much more actively, because it shows how much more effective the scarce public resources can be if they're put as capital into banks that can leverage and lend the same dollars again and again. So these basic principles we are learning and we are taking from the existing banks. And then we're trying to improve on the model. I think we certainly in our case, want to be a financially strong institution that is funded or that pays its operating costs out of what the client pays. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important factor to keep us lean and keep us focused on the clients. So I think that's one particular feature. A second feature, you mentioned already the mobilization of private capital. We are not separating our private and our public sector business. We are running the private and public business on one balance sheet with one staff, of course with individuals with different skills, but we are intending to work smoothly from pure public to pure private solutions. Because so much of what's happening in infrastructure lies in mixed public-private arrangements. Public-private partnerships, state-owned enterprises, local governments, and we hope that by having this sort of single structure where we can finance in both public and private and mixed projects will allow us to be effective in that space. Mm-hmm. Guarantees are a very good example of how to leverage the scarce resource of a development bank more, and we definitely will work actively in that space, again learning from the experience of the existing banks, where I think the guarantee instruments are underutilized. Because I think there is internally too much of an incentive of just making loans as opposed to mobilizing. So finding good ways of giving staff incentives to mobilize resources from others rather than just lending from your own balance sheet is critical.
Perhaps I'll go to your question and adding up. Precisely the way we operate is precisely in line with that. We don't have like in the World Bank, IFC and the other one, everything is together. Infrastructure, productive sector, one thing. Secondly, I think there's a lot of advancement in the most important role of the development banks, which is the catalytic role. In other words, you put $1 and try to get as much as possible. And one thing we are doing, and in fact we are working together, for instance, with the IFC and others, is to have joint efforts in mobilizing resources. I'll give an example. In Colombia, we decided to create a fund for infrastructure. We put $50 million in equity. We had an international bidding, and we got Ashmore. They put $40 million. The authorities in Colombia, they modify some of the regulations for the pension funds and insurance companies so that they could expand the tenor of the instruments they buy, and we launched a fund for infrastructure, $1 billion. We're doing the same thing in Brazil. We're doing the same thing in Uruguay. Guarantees, and those things are very important, because if you want to really be a very important player, don't try to just lend and lend. One thing is that I think together, the World Bank and the IDB, we are putting, and as I see you are doing the same, is to the staff, the benefits of promotions is not because the number of loans you make. It's for $1 that you put, how many other dollars you are mobilizing from others.
I'm going to try and get in two more questions. There's one in the back. It's a lady, I think, there.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gary Kleiman, Kleiman
lady with a
International.
beard.
I wanted to ask Dr. Al-Jasser a question about the broader GCC dimension of your economic reform plan, particularly in terms of financial market development and monetary integration. There's been a lot of activity in debt and equity markets recently after a long pause. And I wonder if you can elaborate on what the near-term scenario would be.
As you well know, the GCC has been working on enhancing the integration of the economies at large. I mean, the 1981 economic agreement between the GCC countries was to move forward with integrating markets and the economies at large. The most recent development is the creation of the Monetary Council, which is to work towards monetary integration within the GCC countries. They're working in earnest, but they're taking their time because they want to make sure that everybody is on board and all the technicalities are well covered, because this is something you don't want to do anything that you may have to reverse. With that also, the financial markets, they're trying to harmonize regulations. There are now common laws that are being circulated to be agreed by the various countries. Even in the fiscal area now, there is a strong movement towards a common VAT tax. All the countries, and now apparently probably beginning of 2018, it may be applied in all of the GCC countries. Movement of capital and people has become very, very, very smooth. You find citizens of all 6 countries moving around, starting businesses, working. Even the pension systems, the government or the private sector pension systems have been calibrated. So if you move from one country to the other, your pension will continue. So there has been a lot of work, a little quiet, low profile, but a lot of work that has been done there. So I think the GCC integration is moving. Maybe slowly, slower than one would want, but I think it is more steady.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, unless I'm allowed 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Political risk has increased in the anti-colleague UBS. I should introduce myself, apologies. So political risk has increased in the mature markets. And we learned that political stability is one of the key ingredients, for sustainable economic growth. How has that affected on a relative basis the agendas in the 3, in your respective areas? So the increase in political risk in the mature markets, has that hindered or has it even accelerated, some of the, or stimulated some of the growth in your areas? Thank you.
Well, from the standpoint of Latin America, as I said before, you are at a point where you are adjusting the political systems. I don't think we are in the region in a very dramatic or serious situation. For instance, one of the countries that people have been concerned about, Brazil, but I think Brazil is on the path of solving the issues, the political issues, so that things will be normal. I think it will take a year or so, but we are moving ahead. Of course, you take in Latin America, I think the delicate issue is in the case of Venezuela. But again, in the case of Venezuela, I think you are getting to a point that because of the economic and financial problems, that you will be coming to a compromise in a way or another. So I agree with you that you have more reason today than you had maybe a year or so, but the trend is positive in the case of Latin America.
I think if I could just take one right as chairman, I don't think that a lady has yet been recognized, and there is a woman at the back who stood up, and if she still wants to ask a question, may I ask you to ask the question?
Okay, thank you. I need to represent my gender because very little diversity in this conference. So my question, a lot of work from the younger generation of women. So my question is, if we look at China, again going back to China, China has become the biggest greenfield investor in the world and the 4th biggest in M&A in 2015. So as we have seen in previous panels that they are saying there is less global appetite for globalization in the US and in Europe, China is taking over. So what is the disruptive effect? And I will ask my admired Enrique Garcia, a great leader in Latin America. So we see it in Brazil. State Grid has just bought CPFL, and a fund, $1 billion fund, Chinese fund, is buying I don't know how many hospitals as we speak. So what is this disruptive effect? We see that also in the Middle East and in other parts of the emerging world. Thank you.
Brazil.
Well,
Your turn.
maybe just two comments on this broad set of issues. One is, I mean, China's growth and China's experience is so much connected to the openness, to the trade and investment agenda China has been pursuing. And I think it's an illustration of the incredible wealth that can be created through openness to trade and investment. And I think it's a story that needs to be told. When we are talking then about how to manage more effectively the possible sort of negative side effects of increased trade, increased investment through global institutions. So let me just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Comment.
Well, maybe from the standpoint of Latin America, in our case, we had an excellent relationship with China. I go quite often. And one of the issues for Latin America is that most of the investment in the flow of funds have been too concentrated in a few countries and in commodities. One message that we have given to them, to the authorities, is to why don't you also invest in areas of technology innovation? Following up what you did, the Chinese. They attracted foreign investment in areas of manufacturing, technology, so forth, and now they are so competitive. So that would be one good thing, and not to remain exclusively in areas of petroleum, of soya, and things like that.
I think I would just add openness, in the GCC, openness is paramount. And therefore, if you look at our import or propensity to import of all the GCC countries, it is extremely high. It's some of the highest in the world. So we're pretty good in that area. But if I could refer to the issue somebody raised, the peace dividend, if you will. GCC countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia, ODA has been since the 70s averaged about 2%. 2%. Unfortunately, without the peace that is happening now, without the peace that we need in the region, some of the countries that need it the most, let's say Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, are not getting it now. So the peace dividend is so clear, and it is in the best interest of everybody, not only for first and foremost, of course, the people of the region, but I think even globally, because without that developmental spending going to the right spots in the region, I think the whole world loses.
I think you'll allow me to thank our three speakers for a truly excellent hour, and many, many thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you.
Very nice to meet you.
I'd just like to thank Jim Wolfensohn, who has done such a great job for the Bretton Woods Committee, and as always, I had mentioned here a couple of times, the father of development, and three great representatives covering the Middle East. And the Middle East doesn't get the coverage it should get these days. Enrique Garcia, an old friend, as no one knows Latin America better than Enrique, and to get a very interesting picture of this new dynamic bank that's being founded in Asia. So let's give them a big hand again, and we have a reception which will start immediately outside. And thank you all for coming and supporting the group.